Hello and welcome to our presentation on the economic growth of Singapore. The period we've chosen is 1965 to 1995.
Like the general question based on our country, which is how does a country half the size of Rhode Island become one of the largest economic centers in the world? And the answer we kind of concluded after all this research is it's a little luck, a lot of hard work, and a couple doses of government intervention along the way. And the first kind of topic that I want to touch on is kind of the history. So this is the history of kind of prior to 1965, which was the general founding of the country, and kind of what things led up to this economic like kind of boom that resulted in Singapore. So some important events were in 1824. This is when Britain first conquered Singapore.
I'm here to colonize you.
In 1824, this is when Britain first conquered Singapore. And so this was when they started setting up like these colonial rules. And during this period of time, Britain essentially had full control over Singapore. And it wasn't until 1959 when Lee Kuan Yew was elected as the first prime minister of Singapore. This was prior to their independence, but it was kind of like the first step towards that. And it wasn't until 6 years later when Singapore finally was declared an independent country. And due to its close ties to Britain, they were quickly, only 3 months later, became part of the UN. And then the kind of last important event to kind of structure this whole economic situation was in 1985. This was kind of the first post-independence recession that Singapore experienced, and it was the first kind of economic downfall that Singapore really experienced during its time. And so it's kind of a wake-up call, which caused a lot of these economic changes. In Singapore, workers weren't very happy, and so they participated in a lot of strikes for various reasons. And the solution that the government came up with was essentially giving an incentive to work for. And in that case, it was public housing. And so this was one of the very first policies ever made in Singapore, because prior to its independence, the workers were already unhappy. And so this was kind of like an instant boost to the morale and made it possible for the workers to have like essentially free housing as long as like they supplied the economy with a certain amount of money. And so basically that's kind of how you get that public housing is by having like an impact on the economy, whether that be working a certain amount, whether that be spending a certain amount, or whether that be like starting a business or owning a business or something like that. And kind of the data shows that during the 1960s, only around 9% of people lived in public housing in Singapore, but then now currently over 80% do. And so it shows just how much this policy changed, like the structure of the Singaporean housing. And these are some examples below of what it looked like.
Okay, another policy they enacted was just generally improving their education. As I put on the top of the slide, the prime minister at the time had a goal to, quote, develop Singapore's only available natural resource, really its people. So they did this in a variety of ways, but primarily by investing in the educational system, by focusing on the student and teacher side of things. For example, they had a national system of generous scholarships that they awarded regularly. There was also an average high teaching salary to attract the best professors and teachers from around the world. And they had government policies that directed talented kids inside universities towards public service. They did this by offering government scholarships that forced kids to work at least 2 years inside the government beforehand. So really promoting the best kind of workers inside that system to promote innovative thinking. Moving on to industrialization. So we can start off at the 1960s. At this time, they had very high unemployment. So what they did was focus on labor-intensive, export-intensive industrialization to urgently create new jobs. This was done by creating industries that produced garments, textiles, toys, and other things like that could be easily exported to other developed nations. They also established the Economic Development Board at this time, a government program that carried out industrial planning, development, investment promotion, and even a different department that managed industrial sites. At the same time, they understood that their lack of resources was definitely an issue, so they proactively went to global markets to attract foreign investors, which leads us into the 1970s, where at the time they had obtained foreign investment from Europe, the US, and other nations, really creating this, establishing this nation as a global business hub, particularly for high-tech products such as computer chips, software, silicon chips, things like that. At the same time, they've also actively created and invested in training more skilled technicians, as mentioned earlier, and liberalized immigration to remove friction for foreign professionals. They also had a policy of trying to push wages up. Now, moving into the 1980s, at this time, high wages started to exceed the GDP growth that they were hoping for. So they entered their first recession in about 20 years. In order to combat this, they entered a second industrial revolution by transitioning towards more capital-intensive operations and high-value goods. For example, they had the Pioneer Industrial Ordinance to provide tax relief to specific industries that they deemed more favorable with the highest growth potential to the economy. And as the manufacturing industries shifted towards high-tech and high-wage goods, they even created a pact with other neighboring countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, so that companies remain headquartered in Singapore while cheap labor goods could be produced elsewhere. And in the 1990s, they shifted once more to become really a hub of technology, knowledge, and innovation by creating more institutes to really develop and research and be kind of a leader in developing new technologies.
Okay, and then as a side part of this, it's kind of like an overarching thing, which is that they kind of adopted that open and free market. And so obviously being in the location of a very central location, they had like a huge influence on Asia, and so they became like a big central hub for Asian trade, and so they facilitated trade between essentially all the Asian countries, and also in Europe due to its close ties with Britain, due to that close relation that they were able to like facilitate a lot of trade in Europe, and then obviously in North America, this was a much more recent aspect where the USSF FTA, which is essentially the United States Singapore Federal Trade Agreement, trade has become like extremely fruitful because essentially it's no tariff trade, and it's like a completely open and free trade between us, which has resulted in like massive trade increases between us. And as you can see below, these are some pictures showing just how much it's changed and how like much trade has become a part of Singapore culture.
Now, another thing they had was just generally business-friendly policies. They tried to make it as easy as possible for international businesses and domestic businesses to prosper. So this was primarily done through a variety of tax incentives. In fact, Singapore has a flat rate of 17% for both foreign and domestic companies, which is the lowest among nearly multiple Asian major powers inside Asia. They also had a tax treaty network. And at the time, they privatized a lot of state-owned properties that were very massive, including like telecom and things like that. There's also a very robust IP, intellectual property framework, for those who are making new products at the time. And just generally, they have a very low cost and time frame to set up a new business. There's also 26 free trade agreements that they have with neighboring countries, which once again just brings down those tariffs for any companies doing business in their nation. So moving on to a primary source, if we go to the next slide, this was a speech given by, excuse my pronunciation, Lee Kuan Yew. He was the prime minister during this time period. Long speech, but here's some just broad takeaways. Are when he says he talks about the raising of the standard of living to get away from poverty, filth, and squalor by using modern science and technology. He also further on goes, I would like to come back here in 10 years to see all the old buildings and even some of the newer ones pulled down and rebuilt. And this being done specifically from an achievement-oriented society. He says, if you want more pay and higher standards of living, I want you to get them better homes, better schools for your children, good hospitals, good social amenities, and better pay. So that kind of gives a glimpse into the issues that they had at the time, which is definitely interesting to look at, especially now because they've obviously solved a lot of those issues with their economic policies.
And so the last kind of thing I'm going to touch on is the more like current growth data. And so this is data not just from our like selected time period. This is just data all in general. And so the initial one is GDP and GDP per capita. So during these portions of time, obviously you can see the massive increase here. GDP, essentially the entire history of Singapore has been increasing massively. And kind of notable jumps are especially early on. They did a lot of trade early on, which resulted in like a huge like percentage jump. And then also more recently, due to their advancements in tourism, they've had a whole separate new like economic influence, which has resulted in like a secondary boom. And also, as you can see here, the GDP per capita and GDP kind of line up, which generally shows that it's like a successful economy, because if both of those line at the same time, it's generally showing that there's good pay for like in general for workers, and also for just people in general in that area. And it's actually the second in the world for GDP per capita.
Okay, moving on to inflation and unemployment. Here we have the inflation chart on the left and unemployment on the right. Starting with inflation, Singapore has managed to average about 2.59% of inflation from 1962 until 2023. They reached an all-time high of 34% in March of 1974, which is primarily due to stagflation across the globe at the time, obviously from the U.S., or stemming from the U.S.'s issues. And then they reached a record low of negative 3% in September of 1976. Obviously, as you see on the graph, they've been able to maintain relatively stable levels of inflation, which is definitely a reflection of their sound economic and fiscal policies. Moving on to unemployment, the graph is clearly they've had some pretty stable unemployment over the past few years, and within more recently at least they've been able to remain at a near 8-year low, or reach an 8-year low, which is definitely impressive regarding in the context of other nations at this time, where there's higher unemployment levels.
And just kind of last thing, these are our citations that we used.